Hello, and this time we're looking at rearranging formulae / changing the subject of a formula, which is essentially saying the same thing. Rearranging a formula is not exactly the same. Rearranging formula is just moving bits of the algebra around, moving things from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the equal sign, or the other way around, and the ultimate goal of that could be to change the subject. And changing the subject, you need to know what a subject is. Well, it's this here. It's the letter on one side that equals the rest. So this is a formula because it has a subject. If you had something like PV equals nRT, that is not a formula, that's an equation, because you've got something complicated on one side and something complicated on another side, so it's just an equation. And you can still rearrange it by timesing and dividing and adding and doing all the things that you can do to rearrange, but if it's a formula, then there's only one thing on one of the sides, usually the left-hand side. So here, T is the subject, B is the subject here, although it's on the right, should really be on the left, but we won't quibble. E is the subject, Q is the subject, Q is the subject, X is the subject, X is the subject, and C is the subject of the formula. So we're going to change the subject of these formulae by rearranging the formulae. And we do that in the same way that we would solve an equation. If we had 2x plus 3 equals 11, what we would do is we'd say, okay, well, if we were doing BIDMAS on this complicated side here, I would have times by the 2 first, x times the 2. I then would have added the 3, and I've got 11. And so I'm going to undo, in reverse order, undo the things that we've done to x to isolate it, to get it on its own. So the last thing we would have done was add 3. We always do timesing first in BIDMAS, so adding 3 would have been last. So we do the opposite, and it sort of goes over the other side. You could, some people say you do the same to both sides. Yes, that's true. So we take 3 from this side and it cancels. Take 3 from this side and it cancels. Some people like to think about moving it to the other side. Move that 3 across and do the opposite when it moves, so it becomes a -3 on the other side. Technically, sort of this do the same to both sides is more correct, but it's absolutely fine if you think about it as move this thing over the other side, and in doing so, you do the opposite maths when it gets there. That's, there's nothing wrong with that as a process. So you can think about it like that if you want. So the opposite of add 3 is take 3. So we get 11 take 3. Now we can work that out. 11 take 3 is 8, so we can write that down. And then the opposite of timesing by 2 is to divide by 2, so we can do that. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and we get our solution. Now with a formula, you can't do that in the same way, in that you can't work it out. You can't do 11 take 3, yes, you can do 11 take 3, but you can't do it with A take B. You can't do it with letters, because you don't know what it is. If there were numbers in it, well then you can simplify it, and more complicated formulae might have numbers in as well. And where you can simplify the numbers, do it, of course. But if you can't, well then you can't, and you just leave the algebra. But we do the same process. I don't want that 3, so do the opposite. I don't want that 2, do the opposite. And here I've got 8 examples, which hopefully will show a number of different scenarios you might be in, where you need to find get rid of things and do the opposite. So hopefully by doing these examples, you'll see how I'm going to deal with it. And in all of these questions, these 8 questions, I'm going to make K the subject. That's what I'm aiming for, is K to be the subject. So looking at the first one, here's K, and what I like to do is I like to underline the thing I want to make the subject, so I don't forget what I'm aiming at. I want to get rid of everything else. Now there's 2 ways to do this. You might say, oh, well, let's get rid of the xy. And how do you do that? Well, be careful. This xy is not minus. That minus belongs to the k, doesn't it? This xy is plus xy. So remember, if you can, get rid of all adding and taking first, and you can just move that whole xy. You don't have to open it up. Just move the whole thing by adding and taking until you've got the thing you want on its own, even if it's got things times on it. We'll see that in examples like this one in a moment. So you could just move this xy. It is currently plus xy, so we're going to take it away. So we get t minus the xy is minus k. Now the only problem with this is the k is minus. Now there's a sweet little thing you can do, which is change the subject of every symbol of every term. Change the sign of every term, and it's called the change of sign rule. So the t becomes minus t, the xy becomes plus xy, and the k becomes negative k becomes positive k, and then we've done it. Now we should write it k equals, and we could put this plus xy first, and then take away the t. That's absolutely legit. We've got it. We've got k as the subject. Doesn't matter what this is. If you'd have left it like this, it wouldn't have hurt, unless the question says in the form of, and then they show you which way round. But that's up to the question. How else could you do this? Well, I don't like it when the thing I want is a negative number or a divide or something like that. So I move this first, so it's not negative anymore. I'm going to add k to both sides. So I'm going to get t plus k equals xy. Then I can get rid of the t, and it's plus t, so I'm going to take it away, and k equals xy minus t. And I find that more sensible, because I'm not having to do that change of sign, and it's all adding and stuff. So I always move the thing that I want if it's not in the place that I want. Which is the same here. The thing I want, k, is on the denominator, and I don't want that. I definitely want it up on the top of a fraction. So I'm going to do the opposite first of the divide by k. Even though it's the thing I want, I'm going to move it to be in a better position. The opposite of divide by k is to times by k. So it appears on the other side. The a is still there, the b is still there, and the equal sign, and the k appears on the right-hand side, but the opposite maths, it's now times instead of divide. But I need to get rid of the b, and that is times b times k, so I'm going to divide by b to get rid of it, and we get that k is a divided by b. Now you notice that I've just switched it round as I've done that. Sorry, that's terrible. Let's just do it again. My handwriting with this stylus is not very good. I've made it worse. Anyway, you know what I mean. That's supposed to be a k. It looks terrible. I've switched it round in my head. If you divide by b, it'd be on the left-hand side, but I've just flipped the whole thing, so written that on the left and this on the right. So, same thing here. My k is on the denominator. Please don't bring the k up on its own. You can't. This divide sign here, this fraction, is implying brackets. It's like you don't need brackets around the d, but you definitely need them around here when you move it, because it's saying d divided by the whole denominator, k plus f. So that is being contained together. So when I multiply by the denominator, put a bracket around it, the whole thing comes up. D equals e bracket k plus f. Okay, now there's two options. You could expand the bracket, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to divide by the e and get d divided by e is k plus f. I can now drop the bracket because there's nothing happening to the bracket. And now I can deal with the add by doing the opposite, and the opposite is take away. So we get d over e minus f equals k. And of course I'd switch that round to be k equals d over e minus f. Now it's perfectly fair if you want to expand the bracket and then take away the ef and then divide by e. It is just an equivalent form of this. If you added these together as fractions, like make that over 1 and then did adding fractions, well, taking them, you'd get the same thing. So it's absolutely fine, but that's just the way I prefer to do it. The key thing for me here is always to keep in mind BIDMAS. So before we got rid of adding and taking first and then did dividing. Maybe we didn't do that up here anyway, but that's what you would do. But I didn't deal with the adding here because it was in the bracket. Okay, and remember BIDMAS, brackets happen first, then timesing. So when I'm undoing, the timesing is undone first because the bracket is shielding whatever's inside. And inside there might be more timesing and more adding and powers and things. Yes, but the bracket shields it until you get rid of everything else first. Right, if you need to process that a bit longer, pause the video because I'm about to erase that one. So I've got space. Welcome back if you just paused. If you didn't, that's fine. Let's erase that and do this one. Now, this is interesting because it's inside a bracket. So I'm going to wait and deal with the times. First, I'm going to deal with this power that's outside the bracket. And the opposite of squaring is square root. So I'm going to say pk, having got rid of the squared, is the square root of q. Now, because it's the square root, and I don't have any context whether things can be positive or negative, I do need to put a plus or minus on that, because you always get two answers when you do a square root, a positive one and a negative one. And now I can get rid of this times. The opposite of timesing is dividing, so I can divide by the p and get that k equals plus or minus the square root of q all over p. And that's it, rearranged. I'm just doing the opposite maths in the reverse order. It's like pressing the undo button when you've done something, on the computer. You press Control Z and undo, and it undoes the last thing that you did, and then the next last thing, and the next last thing. We're trying to do that following the maths through. Now here's another example where the thing I want, k, is times by t, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. I'm just going to treat that as one thing and get that on its own first, and then we'll worry about getting rid of the t. Now it's negative. I don't like my k being negative, or whatever it is I'm changing the subject to be negative. So I need to move it first. I personally would move it first. So I'm going to add it, because that's the opposite of taking, and get p equals q plus kt. Now, just look at it afresh. It's the q in the way, and it's a positive q. Remember, it's the sign in front of each term that belongs to it. So this plus q we need to take away, and flip it in my head. I get kt equals the p that's still on the other side minus the q, so I've just taken it away, and then I can divide by the t. Now I've got the kt on its own. Now I can open it up and say, okay, how do I get rid of this t? Divide it. Now I'm going to be lazy and just do it like this. Obviously you'd write it out again in your test, in your exam, and you'd draw a better t than that. But because I can erase things, I've just written it quickly like that. Another divide. So again, the thing I want's on the bottom. This time we haven't got a plus, so we could bring the whole thing up. You could say, oh, there's a bracket, and bring the whole thing up. But because it's all times and divide, there's no adding. This is y divided by k, and then also divided by w, or k and w times together first, and then divide by y, both of them at once by timesing them together. So because in this case it's all times and divide, I can just multiply up the k on its own. Couldn't do it here because of the add, but can do it here because there's no adding. It's all just one thing. So I could just say times the k up to this side, kx equals y over w, and then divide the x down and get k is y over xw. Now remember, you don't need to do a fraction in a fraction in a fraction. If you're dividing something, it just joins the denominator. And if you're timesing something up from the denominator, it just joins the numerator on the other side. K squared is x. Well, we've already done a squared one down here. The opposite of squaring is square rooting, and there's nothing else to do, so we put k equals root x. But be careful, because you'll lose a mark for that. Remember, if you square root, then a plus and minus sign is necessary in front of it, please. And this time, we've got k is the square root. Now let's just think about BIDMAS. Brackets, well, there's no brackets. Indices, now that's your order if it's BODMAS, that's your powers, and square rooting is the same as powers. Square and square rooting, they're just the opposite of each other. So it's this square root that would have happened first, then multiplied by the a, multiplication and division come next, division then multiplication if it's BIDMAS, but it doesn't matter which order, does it? They just happen at the same time. So timesing happens next, then the adding. That's the A and the S of the BIDMAS, add and subtract. So this thing happened first, then this one, then this one. And we're going to undo them in that order. So the opposite of adding B is to take B. So we get A root K equals C minus B. Can I just point out that in no point in the whole of these questions have I ever written down what I'm doing. I think what I'm doing, and what I write out for the examiner when they say show clear working out, is what's left after I've done it. So I've thought take away the b from both sides, or move the b over, and it becomes a negative when it does. So I've written down what's left once that one thing's happened. And what's left is the a root k is still there, the equals c is still there, but the b has moved over and become minus. So I've written out what I've got. Please don't do things like, a root k plus b minus b equals a root k and c minus root b. Don't do those steps where you write your, especially when you're solving as well. When, don't write 11 minus 3 equals 8 and then this minus this equals this, because you can't follow that as algebraic working. The examiner can't use that to give you marks. Whereas if you write down what's left after you do that maths in your head, then you get marks for it. Even if you mess up the final answer, then you'll get your working out stages. Right, so the second thing to happen was the times by a, and as we've undone the third thing, the next in reverse order would be the a. It's times by our root k, so the opposite is divide. So I get root k equals c minus b all over a. Make sure when you move something to the other side, you do it to the whole side. So if you're going to times something, let's say you've got, x over 2 equals k plus 3 plus b. Okay, when you times by 2, you can't just write, times by 2 and put it on the k. You need a bracket so that everything gets times by 2. Yeah? And if you need to expand the bracket, fine. If not, then that doesn't matter. But you have to make sure that you times everything, which sometimes means adding in brackets, sometimes means making sure that fraction line is all the way under. So we've done the last thing. We took away the b. We've done the next last thing, which is divide by the a. And now the opposite of the square root is to square. So I'm going to say k equals, and I need a big bracket. So if I just write squared, that's only going to square the b. So I can't do that. I need a big bracket, c minus b over a, close the bracket, and then squared. Okay? Now I can leave it like that. It didn't say change the subject and make it look nice. So you could, have the top squared, the bottom squared, expand it, whatever. But if it doesn't ask it in a particular form, as soon as you've got the letter you want on its own on this side, then you can stop. Notice I haven't put my plus or minus on. You don't need plus or minus when you square something. It's only if you do the square root. If you introduce something, if you introduce a square root into the formula, plus or minus gets put in. But if you're getting rid of a square root, if they haven't put the plus or minus in, then you don't have to worry about it. They're using the plus value, so that's fine. So we square it, and it's still plus. So don't worry about that unless you introduce the square root. I've got my k equals, so that's fine. And those are the 8 questions done. Now, are there other situations where changing the subject might happen and it'd be more complicated? Yes, of course. But it's always just layers of complexity. So even if you've got something quite long and involved and complicated, you isolate, well, this is what I want. And so what can I do to get rid of the other things? There are situations where the thing you want comes up twice. So if you've got something like p equals x minus 2 over 3 minus x, for example, and you want x to be the subject, well, it appears twice. Now this is already a ridiculously long video, so if that comes up, then you want to take that up as a bracket, and then you want to expand that bracket, and you need to collect the x's together, and if they don't just merge together because of that p, then you factorize the x out. But I think if you need me to go through that, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll make that a separate video. But certainly, when you've just got it in once, you can even do this, sort of label, this comes first, second, third, and just go back and do the opposite maths to move everything to the other side, okay? And as long as you obey the rules of algebra as you do that, and you make sure you do it to the whole side with brackets or where necessary, or that big fraction line, then you shouldn't go too far wrong, if at all. If you have any questions on what I have done, or if there's something you need to do which I haven't explained and you can't see how to build up the layers, then let me know in the comments down below. But otherwise, well done if you got all the way through this long video, and ta-ra for now.